All right, let's get started here. So now would be a good time to put away the basketball stats and the face painting tutorials and the games and all of that stuff, because this chapter is kind of a difficult chapter. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it would be good to know this stuff so that you do well on the test. So we got a little bit of stuff to talk about today, but first, of course, we want to go over the homework. So, number 1 says, what are the 3 phases of cellular respiration? Sam, hit me with one. Glycolysis. Okay. Jace, you got another one? The Krebs cycle. Oh, Logan. What else could you have there instead of Krebs cycle? Citric acid cycle. So those are 2 terms that we can use interchangeably, and I don't care which one you use on a test. Matt, what would be the 3rd stage of cellular respiration? The electron transport chain. Okay. Now, even though there's an electron transport chain in photosynthesis, there's a little bit of a difference, because where does the electron transport chain come in photosynthesis? Yeah, it's in the thylakoid, but I'm saying as far as the stages, what stage is the electron transport chain? Yeah. So in cellular respiration, it's the 3rd stage. In photosynthesis, it's the 2nd. So where in the cell does the glycolysis part of cellular respiration happen? In the cytoplasm. Okay, and we know that because bacteria cells can still do glycolysis, and they don't have mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle, that's going to be in the mitochondria. And so is the electron transport chain. Okay, do our cells have mitochondria? Yep. What about plant cells? Yep. What about fungi cells? Yes. Okay, and most protists do too. So remember, mitochondria are pretty much in all eukaryotes. There are a couple exceptions in the protists, but there's all sorts of weird things in the protists. But all fungi, plants, and animals have mitochondria. Remember, just because plants have chloroplasts don't mean they don't have mitochondria too. They need both. All right, number 5 says, how many ATP, and it says net, are made in the glycolysis part of cellular respiration? So basically it's asking, how many ATP are actually freed up in glycolysis? 2. How many ATP are made in the Krebs cycle part of cellular respiration? There's 1, but we can say, Matt's saying 2, so we can say 2 per glucose. Okay? So, I mean, if you're thinking, when we take a full glucose through to the end, yeah, there would be 2 that are made there. Okay? And then how many ATP are made in the electron transport part of cellular respiration? 32 to 34. Okay? So we can see that the electron transport chain of cellular respiration is the one that really yields the most energy there. In which phase of cell respiration is carbon dioxide made? Which one, Hannah? In the Krebs cycle. That's what I had. Aren't you the one that said ETC? Matt? Oh. Yeah. Okay, so that's where the carbon dioxide comes out. When we breathe out carbon dioxide, all that comes from the Krebs cycle. And remember, that starts out as glucose. We're breaking the glucose up, and it gets released as carbon dioxide. Okay, in which phase of cellular respiration is water made? And the ETC. That's the one that Matt was apparently looking at. Okay? And remember, that water is made when the oxygen that we breathe in accepts an electron, and then it'll combine with hydrogen. So, I guess that answers number 10. Oxygen is used up in the electron transport chain. And then finally, Nick, where do we use up glucose? No. Glycolysis. Because remember, what does glycolysis actually mean? Yeah, splitting glucose. When you know your Latin roots, makes it easy. Okay, this is a pretty decent start. I mean, I don't know. I say that with every worksheet, but that's why I have you do these questions. It's not just busy work. It's because these are the kind of things I'm going to ask on the test. So this would be something good to look over to remind yourself of some of the things that you might see on the test. All right. We have a little bit of stuff to talk about today. And then we're going to watch a video about drunk birds. So today we're going to talk about the terms aerobic and anaerobic. Has anybody even looked at their vocabulary yet? Do we know what those mean? Dave's going to take a shot at it.
All right, so aerobic.
Uh-huh.
You don't say the no energy.
He says no energy.
No oxygen.
No oxygen. So yeah, air is kind of the root word there, but it really means the oxygen. Okay, so aerobic uses oxygen. Anaerobic does not. So we'll just put no oxygen. And where we're applying these words is towards the way that certain organisms are going to break down their food to get energy. Okay? So we've got two different processes that we learned about. We've got cell respiration, and then we've got fermentation. We talked about lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. Those are just two different kinds. Which one of those would be anaerobic? Fermentation. Remember we talked about how our muscles can go through lactic acid fermentation when there's not enough oxygen present. So here we can write that fermentation is an example of anaerobic metabolism. Let's put metabolism here. Okay, our example of aerobic would be cellular respiration. What's that? Yeah, metabolism. Metabolism just means breaking down food and getting energy. Okay? So cellular respiration is an aerobic type of metabolism, and fermentation is an anaerobic type of metabolism. Okay, which one of those has to have a mitochondria? Aerobic. So this right here, you need mitochondria. And anaerobic, it all takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, even our lactic acid fermentation nothing happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria are basically locked up when there's no oxygen around. Okay, and then the other thing we want to look at is how much energy is released. So we want to look at it basically in terms of us. So let's say right here, per glucose, aerobic cellular respiration frees up anywhere from 36 to 38 ATP. Okay, what about an anaerobic process like lactic acid fermentation? How many ATP do you actually make per glucose? Just the two that come out of glycolysis. Okay, so which one's the most efficient? Aerobic respiration, but you have to have the oxygen. Okay, and that's why our muscle cells go through aerobic respiration, cellular respiration, as much as possible. But if you run out of oxygen, if you're running too fast or lifting weights too much, and you can't breathe hard enough to get oxygen to all your cells, they will convert over and go through anaerobic respiration, or anaerobic fermentation, I mean. You only get 2 ATP per glucose, but it will still power the cells. Okay? This actually helps explain a little bit why, working out, running, that kind of stuff will burn a lot more calories than a sedentary lifestyle, because we have to use more glucose to get the energy for the cells. Okay? When we think about this, this is a less efficient process, and that's true. But it also means that you are actually getting rid of more glucose, more of the food that you have taken in for each amount of energy that the cell is going to use. So trying to get where you are actually breathing hard and using up more energy than the oxygen can provide for cellular respiration will help burn more calories.
So if you never exercise, you just have really efficient.
Well, the process is efficient, yes. That means you're getting as much energy out as you can because you're able to provide as much oxygen. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the most healthy for your body. Okay, so that's the main difference between aerobic and anaerobic ways of metabolism. Questions? It'll happen someday. One of these times you guys will surprise me. All right. Before we watch the video on drunk birds, let's talk about how we make moonshine. Now, I know we talked about this last year, but we got a couple new people in here that may not have heard. And it's always good to have a refresher on making of alcoholic beverages. Except, of course, remember, really, we're talking about making ethanol for fuel. That's all. Because it's the same process. So the ethanol plants take in lots of corn. You would also probably use corn if you want to make moonshine. All you do is you get a big vat, you put in corn. Usually you want to crush it because that will increase the surface area and make lots more little pieces for things to work on. You're also going to put in water. And then the most important thing, you're going to put in some sort of organism that is going to do alcoholic fermentation. And that could either be yeast, which is the most common, or bacteria. No, you just throw all those things in a big pot and you let it sit. And it smells awful. But what happens is the bacteria or the yeast that are in there are breaking down the sugars in the corn, because, these things don't have mitochondria, they are going to go through alcoholic fermentation. So as they eat the sugars in the corn and break them down to keep the ball rolling so that they can get energy, they're going to produce alcohol as a byproduct. They also produce carbon dioxide, so they'll be bubbling and stuff, but we don't care about that if we're making moonshine. And that alcohol is going to build up in the vat. Now, the interesting thing here is, at some point, the amount of alcohol the alcohol content is going to get so high that it'll start to actually kill off the yeast or the bacteria.
And was he drinking before that? And you said you started drinking all the bacteria.
I don't believe any of the bacteria that you would use, and again, 99% of the time you'd be using yeast. I'm just saying there are bacteria that can be used, okay? But I don't believe any of the bacteria that you would use in this would, be harmful for anybody. There's hundreds of thousands of bacteria strains that are not harmful to humans in any way. But you wouldn't want to drink this. It's old water crushed corn and bacteria. No, yuck. You would not want to drink that. Okay? Whether we're making fuel or moonshine, what you need to do next is get the alcohol out of the rest of that stuff. And so that's where the still comes in. So we take our pot and we light a fire under it. That's fire. Here, I'll write it here so we know that it's fire. The interesting thing about alcohol is that it has a lower boiling point than water. So as the temperature goes up, the alcohol will actually boil off and turn into a gas before the water does. Now, there will be some evaporation, so some water will come out. But for the most part, we're going to boil off all the alcohol before the water, but we got to catch it. Because if you just do this, it's just going to go up into the atmosphere, and that's going to be a waste.
Process, does it matter the ratio of water and corn?
Not really. The biggest thing would be putting in enough yeast, enough of the organism, and of course enough of the corn so that there's a few food source. So I guess the amount of yeast versus the amount of corn would be the big thing. The water is mostly just so that they can move around and get to all the pieces. So we put a cap on this, right? But of course, we don't just want to put a cap on this because that would just explode, and that would be bad. We also put a little tube that comes out like this, and sometimes they're in a coil or whatever. But the whole point is that the alcohol that boils off is going to go up, because it's a gas, it's going to go up and kind of go through this tube, and then we cool this down some way. Most of the time we're just going to spray water on it. So water to cool, and as it cools down, that will turn back into a liquid, and so it'll drip out here, and this is where you put your mason jar. Because, of course, if you make moonshine, it has to go into a mason jar. It's the only way to do it.
So how long does that coil have to be for it to cool off?
It would depend on how big the vat is and basically what the volume of alcohol steam that you're getting off. So if you had... Uh-huh. You're getting pretty technical on the dimensions here, Matt. So, yeah, I don't know. Usually they'd have a coil of about, I would say, 3 to 4 yards of copper tubing that it would go through. And the reason why they usually... You could, but the reason why they usually put it in a coil is because instead of it being, way over here, it would all be condensed right here in this coil, so that you have 3 or 4 yards wound around instead of, 3 or 4 yards away. Okay? And then that's pretty much it. The stuff that drips out is going to be mainly alcohol. Again, there will be some water in there because there will be some evaporation happening. But this process right here is called a distillation, which is why this is called a still. Distillation means separating two substances based on their boiling points.
Could you, instead of putting it in a mason jar, could you put it in another thing and boil it again?
Yes, actually you could. And that would be called a second distillation. So higher proof things like whiskey and, some of those things, they may do a second distillation where they take that and they boil it again, and then more of the water will be left behind. It will be a pure form of ethanol. And they'll do that in the ethanol plant too. They will want a higher percentage of ethanol versus water.
All that's going up though and then dropping down, is all that just like straight alcohol?
Well, I said it's mostly alcohol, a little bit of water because of evaporation.
I was saying it was just straight alcohol.
That's what moonshine is, and yeah, it's horrible. It's like, I mean, yeah.
Well, why do they make it?
Because it's fairly easy to make and you don't have to buy it. I don't know. No, it is one of the most god-awful things you'll ever taste in your life. Not till you're 21, of course. Now, if you're thinking about going home and trying this, let me tell you that to make moonshine legally, you have to have a license, and you're not going to get a license until you're 21 for sure, so probably shouldn't do this. If the cops show up, I would tell them that you're making ethanol fuel to put in your car. Okay. Now, you do have to be careful of the stuff that you're using, okay? A lot of those guys in the backwoods would just use whatever stuff they had, and so they might boil it in an old car radiator and, have some, like, lead-lined pipes and stuff. And so people have gone blind because they use materials that put lead and, and other types of things into the alcohol. So you want to have a nice, clean still. And, I mean, there are guys that make moonshine. They have licenses, and they've got pretty fancy setups, but I mean, it is an investment. For a still, for a little. Yeah. So unlike beer or wine, where you can legally make a certain amount as long as you're not selling it without any sort of license, because this is a higher proof alcohol, you're required by law to have a license and apply for it. So that's how you make moonshine. But it's all based on that fermentation process. All those poor little yeast are trying to do is eat and live. And instead we kill them off and take their waste products and put them in our gas tanks. So this is what yeast look like at a microscopic level. I mean, if you've ever seen yeast, it looks like kind of a powder. But those are actually granules of a whole bunch of little yeast cells. So this is what yeast actually look like under a microscope. Tiny little one-celled organisms. Moonshine again. And remember, the same exact process is going on when you make bread. It's just here, there's not as much yeast, so we're not going to produce near as much alcohol. And the other thing is that when you bake the bread, the alcohol disperses, it evaporates off, and you're just left with the bread behind. The whole reason why we use yeast in this case, again, is just to make those little bubbles to make the bread rise. Before we found that out, I mean, like if you were reading the Bible and stuff, it'll talk about unleavened bread, and so that was bread that didn't raise at all, and it was just, I mean, they'd bake the dough, and it didn't have any bubbles, and it was a lot harder and stuff like that. So yeast is useful. Okay, I've got a couple videos that we're going to watch.